Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a Europe where Paris speaks Norse, where the churches of Rome have been replaced by the halls of Udon, where every king from the frozen north to the warm Mediterranean bows to a single warlord who rose from nothing, a fisherman's son who dared to dream of an empire. History tells you the Vikings raided Europe, but history doesn't tell you how close they came to owning it. There was a man, a warlord, a visionary, a force of nature so terrifying that European kings whispered his name in dark rooms and prayed he would never find them. His name was Ragnar, and what he almost built would have changed everything.
You first have to understand the world he was born into. Forget the romanticized version. Forget the television dramas and the Hollywood glamour. The Viking world was brutal. Scandinavia in the late 8th century was a land of relentless cold, scarce farmland, and brutal competition. Men fought for resources that barely existed. Winters killed the weak. The sea, vast, merciless, unforgiving, was both a highway and a graveyard. To survive here, you didn't just need strength, you needed hunger. A hunger so deep, it became something else entirely. It became ambition. The Norse people were not savages stumbling blindly across the water. They were engineers, navigators, traders, and warriors simultaneously. Their longships were the most advanced seafaring vessels in the world, shallow enough to sail up rivers, strong enough to cross the Atlantic. A Viking longship could beach directly on a coastline, disgorge 200 armed warriors in minutes, and be gone before a defending army even formed ranks. They were not raiders who got lucky. They were a military technology the world had never seen before. But their greatest weakness was the same thing that made them so dangerous. They were divided. Dozens of chieftains, hundreds of clans, feuds that stretched back generations. Viking fought Viking over cattle, over women, over territory, over insults spoken 20 winters ago. Their power was scattered, explosive but unfocused, like fire that burns everything, including itself. What the Viking world needed was someone who could take all of that fire and aim it in one direction. Enter Ragnar. Born to a minor chieftain in the windswept fjords of what is now Norway, Ragnar Lothbrok, Hairy Breeches, a name earned through legend rather than birth records, was not supposed to be anyone remarkable. History is filled with men like him who died young, forgotten in the mud of some nameless skirmish. But Ragnar was different in one crucial way. He could see further than anyone around him. While other Viking leaders raided for silver and slaves, Ragnar looked at the divided kingdoms of Europe, the fractured remnants of Charlemagne's empire, the squabbling Frankish lords, the vulnerable English kingdoms still raw from their own internal wars, and he saw something else entirely. He saw a continent waiting to be taken.
His early raids were not random. This is what most people miss about Ragnar. Where other chieftains struck and retreated, Ragnar studied. He observed how European armies formed. He noted that coastal monasteries were not just wealthy, they were undefended. He recognized that the Frankish kings, for all their territory and titles, could not respond quickly to an enemy that moved by sea. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 sent a shockwave through Christian Europe. A sacred monastery, believed to be protected by God himself, was sacked by men who didn't fear that God at all. It was a message. Whether Ragnar led that raid personally is debated by historians, but the tactical genius behind the escalating campaign that followed bears his fingerprints. After each raid, Ragnar returned home, not to rest, to recruit. He arrived back in the fjords with silver, with slaves, with plunder, and with stories. Stories of European cities so rich their churches were lined with gold. Stories of armies that ran from longships. Stories of a world where a bold man with a sword could take anything he wanted. Chieftains who had feuded with each other for decades listened. Ragnar didn't conquer the Viking clans, he seduced them. He offered them something more valuable than silver. He offered them glory. One by one, the clan leaders fell in behind him, not because he forced them, though he could, but because his vision was irresistible. A united Norse force striking coordinated blows across Europe, too fast and too numerous to be stopped. By the time European kings realized what was forming in the north, it was already too late. And if you're finding this story as gripping as I do, hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel bring more stories like this one to life.
The year is 845. 120 longships sail up the Seine River toward Paris. Read that again. 120 ships, thousands of warriors, moving upriver, deep inside Frankish territory. King Charles the Bald, and history did not give him that nickname to be kind, scrambled to respond. He split his forces on both banks of the river, a catastrophic tactical error. Ragnar's forces destroyed one half of the army. Then, crucially, they did something that would have made Roman generals wince with horror. They hanged 111 Frankish prisoners on an island in the Seine, in full view of the remaining army. The effect was instantaneous. Charles's forces dissolved. Men threw down their weapons and ran. The psychological warfare was as devastating as the military campaign. Paris lay open. Ragnar entered the City of Kings. He did not sack it to ash. This is the part most people don't expect from a Viking warlord. Ragnar extracted an enormous ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver, and left. Because Ragnar understood something most raiders didn't. A destroyed city produces nothing. A terrified city keeps paying. This was not the thinking of a barbarian. This was the thinking of an empire builder. Across the English Channel, the story was the same. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia were being steadily dismantled. Viking armies, the Great Heathen Army, which some historians believe Ragnar's sons helped lead, weren't just raiding anymore. They were occupying. They were settling. They were establishing what would become the Danelaw, a massive swath of England governed under Norse law. In Ireland, Viking settlements had already transformed the island's coastline. Dublin, Waterford, Limerick, Viking foundations. In Normandy, Viking settlers were being granted land by a Frankish king too exhausted to fight them. The map of Europe was changing, not at the edges, at the center.
Here is where history becomes something extraordinary. Stand back and look at the map of Europe in the mid-9th century through Ragnar's eyes. England fracturing, 3 of 4 major kingdoms under severe Norse pressure. The 4th, Wessex, fighting for its life. Francia, humiliated, paying tribute, its nobility in chaos after the death of Louis the Pious fractured Charlemagne's empire into competing fragments. Ireland, already hosting Norse cities on its coast. The Mediterranean. Viking ships had already reached it. Norse raiders struck Spain's Atlantic coast. They entered the Strait of Gibraltar. They raided Morocco. They sailed along the Mediterranean coast of France and Italy. The Byzantine emperor received a Viking embassy. The Byzantine emperor. Vikings were not at the edge of the known world. They were inside it, threading through every waterway, every coastline, every river system in Europe and beyond. What Ragnar envisioned, what his campaigns were methodically building toward, was a Norse sphere of dominance, not necessarily a single centralized empire in the Roman tradition, something more fluid, more Norse, a network of tribute relationships, settlements, and alliances, all tied together by the threat of those black-sailed longships. A Viking world system. The groundwork was being laid in real time. The Danelaw in England created a self-sustaining Norse population on British soil. Normandy was doing the same in France. Norse trading networks ran from the Arctic to Constantinople along the great rivers of what is now Russia. The Rus, they were called, and they gave their name to an entire civilization. The empire wasn't a fantasy, it was forming. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you're looking for, subscribe right now. Every week, we go somewhere history gets genuinely dangerous.
But empires are not built by one man alone. And Ragnar had enemies he could not raid, could not ransom, could not intimidate. He had enemies inside his own vision. The fatal flaw of Norse conquest was the same flaw that had kept Vikings divided for generations. Independence was sacred. Every chieftain who rode under Ragnar's banner was also a man who believed himself capable of leading. Every son Ragnar raised was a man who would one day want his own kingdom. The unity that Ragnar had stitched together with silver and charisma was always fragile. And then there was King Alla of Northumbria. According to the Norse sagas, and historians argue fiercely about how much of this is myth and how much is memory, Ragnar launched a raid on Northumbria that went catastrophically wrong. His forces were defeated. Ragnar himself was captured. King Alla's execution of Ragnar became one of the most infamous acts of the Viking Age. The Blood Eagle, a ritual killing so brutal that even hardened Norse warriors considered it among the worst deaths imaginable. Whether it happened exactly as the sagas describe is uncertain. What is not uncertain is the consequence. Ragnar's sons, Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, Hvitserk, Sigurd, Ubba, did not mourn quietly. They assembled the largest Viking army England had ever seen, the Great Heathen Army. Thousands of warriors landing on English soil in 865, not to raid, not to take tribute, to conquer, to avenge. Northumbria fell, Alla was killed, East Anglia was overrun. The Viking hammer fell on England with a ferocity that stunned even people who had lived through decades of Norse raids. But here is the cruel irony of history. At the precise moment when Ragnar's sons were at their most powerful, when the Viking conquest of England seemed inevitable, the one man who could have stopped them was finding his feet. Alfred of Wessex, later called Alfred the Great. A sickly young king from the last surviving Anglo-Saxon kingdom who had no right to survive what was coming, who was driven into the marshes of Somerset, hiding from Viking armies, reduced to burning a peasant woman's cakes in a farmhouse while his kingdom crumbled. And yet, Alfred did not give up. He studied the Vikings, he understood their tactics, he built burhs, fortified towns across Wessex that couldn't be bypassed, that forced Norse armies to fight on unfavorable terms. He negotiated, he built alliances, he rebuilt his army with patience and cunning. At the Battle of Edington in 878, Alfred crushed the Viking army led by Guthrum. The Viking leader was baptized a Christian. The Danelaw was formalized. Vikings kept the north and east, but Wessex and English civilization survived. Ragnar's empire had its limits. And in Francia, similar resistance was hardening. The Vikings, who had once sailed unopposed up the Seine, found bridges built across the river, bridges designed specifically to block longships. European kingdoms, taught hard lessons by decades of Norse raids, were adapting. The window was closing.
Stand in the ashes of what Ragnar built and ask yourself what was actually lost. The Vikings came staggeringly close. If Alfred had died in those Somerset marshes, England becomes Norse. A united Norse England, combined with the Danelaw that already existed, combined with Normandy,
combined with Irish Viking cities, combined with Norse Russia, the entire northern arc of Europe is Norse. The history of Christianity changes. The history of the English language changes. The history of exploration changes, because it was Norse sailors who reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, and a Viking-dominated Europe would have had every reason to push that discovery further. The world we live in was decided, in part, by a sickly king hiding in a marsh, and by the sons of Ragnar spending their fury on vengeance when they might have spent it on empire. History turns on moments so small, so human, so fragile that it makes your chest tight to look at them directly. Ragnar Lothbrok, whether the man himself is historical legend or composite myth, represents something real. The Viking Age was not a footnote, it was a hinge point, a moment when the direction of Western civilization was genuinely uncertain. The Norse people did not fail because they lacked power. They failed because they were too early, because the unified, disciplined state building that conquest requires takes generations to learn, and Ragnar's generation ran out of time. His sons were warriors. What they needed to be was administrators, and so the empire that could have been remained exactly that, a possibility, a ghost, a road not taken. Do you think the Vikings could have actually ruled Europe if Ragnar had lived and his sons had held together? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely read every single one, and this debate gets fierce.
The Viking Age did not end with a single defeat. It faded slowly as Norse settlers intermarried with local populations, converted to Christianity, and became, over generations, the Normans of France, the English nobility, the Rus of Eastern Europe. Their blood runs in more European veins than most people realize. Ragnar's dream didn't die. It dissolved into the continent he had tried to conquer. And in the end, the Vikings didn't fail to change Europe. They changed it completely, just not in the way Ragnar had imagined. But here is what should unsettle you. The Viking threat, for all its ferocity, came from the north and west, from peoples Europe knew, from waters Europe had learned to watch. Centuries later, another threat arrived from a direction no European ruler had ever seriously guarded. From the east, from the endless steppe. Mounted on horses that never seemed to tire, commanded by generals who made even Ragnar's tactical brilliance look modest, carrying the largest land empire in human history behind them like a shadow, the Golden Horde began marching toward Rome. And unlike the Vikings, they didn't need longships, they didn't need rivers, they needed nothing but open ground, and Europe had plenty of it. The nightmare the Vikings almost became was nothing compared to what was coming. Click the next video. The Golden Horde's march on Rome is waiting for you, and I promise it's even more terrifying than this.